They had pulled in just before dusk the night before, June 14, 2012, driving a rented silver Subaru with a borrowed tent in the back and a second-hand cooler clattering with canned beans and juice boxes. The Carters were not experienced campers, but Pine Glade Wilderness Reserve came highly recommended. Wide trails, ranger presence, and a reputation for safety. Jacob and Megan had pored over park maps for weeks, circling sites with low elevation and cell coverage just in case. Ranger Station 9, nestled near a gentle bend of the Clearwater River, offered what they were looking for: privacy, quiet, and a manageable hike from the car. Their daughter Hazel, 2 years old and obsessed with ladybugs and banana chips, toddled beside them in a sun hat too big for her head, occasionally flopping down in the dirt just to feel the ground. Photos from that evening, taken on Megan's old phone, show the family setting up camp in front of a pine-ringed clearing, the sun threading gold light through branches behind them. Hazel had a red plastic bucket, a stuffed rabbit, and a pair of pink Velcro sneakers, one already coming loose at the heel. She didn't wander far. They made sure of that. It wasn't their first trip as a family, but it was their first time so far from home. Megan had packed extra wipes, extra snacks, extra batteries. Jacob had practiced folding the tent 3 times before they left. They were cautious people, the kind who double-checked stove valves and read online reviews before booking hotels. So when Jacob left camp around 7:45 the next morning to collect some fallen branches from the ridge trail, he didn't think twice about leaving Megan with Hazel for a few minutes. The fire pit was cold. Breakfast was still being prepared. Powdered eggs and instant coffee. Megan had her back turned for less than 2 minutes, maybe less than 1, she later told police. She was boiling water, humming something under her breath, when she called over her shoulder for Hazel to come back and sit on the blanket. There was no answer. She turned around and the tent flap was open. She stepped over to check, thinking maybe Hazel had crawled in to grab her rabbit. But the tent was empty. She looked left toward the cluster of ferns where Hazel had been playing, then toward the edge of the trees. The quiet hit her first. Not peaceful, not still, but wrong. There was no laughter, no shuffle of small feet, only the rustle of leaves and the faint sound of water. Megan's voice rose, calling again, then louder, then shouting. By the time Jacob returned, branches under one arm, she was already running in circles, calling the name over and over, voice cracking. Hazel was nowhere. They searched the site in frantic, spiraling loops, the tent, the trail, the short path to the river. Megan thought she saw something pink down by the trees, but it was just a scrap of trash caught in a branch. At 8:22 a.m., Jacob used his cell phone to call the ranger station. His voice was flat, breathless. "Our daughter's missing. We don't know how long. Maybe 20 minutes. By 9 a.m., a team of 3 rangers had arrived. They began grid searches almost immediately, moving slowly, calling the child's name with practiced calm. A K-9 unit was summoned from the nearby county. The initial search radius was half a mile. It would soon grow to 5. There were no signs of struggle, no claw marks, no blood, no scream reported by other campers. Rangers noted how oddly clean the site was. No clear toddler footprints leading away, only one small shoe found 40 feet from the tent beneath a curved pine root at the trailhead, as if dropped mid-step. There were no broken twigs, no drag marks in the soil. The shoe was placed into an evidence bag and marked. A ranger later said he had a sinking feeling as soon as he saw it, because it looked like it had been set there, not lost. By mid-morning, the entire area had been sealed off. Searchers with dogs, drones, and thermal equipment were deployed in every direction. Helicopters scanned the treetops. Park staff logged visitor check-ins, combed trail cameras, and checked the dam gates downstream in case the river had taken something they couldn't see. Nothing turned up. The family, still in shock, sat in the ranger vehicle as volunteers passed by with maps and radios, calling into the silence. Megan kept repeating the same words under her breath, barely audible. She was just right there. She was right there. By sunset, the site felt less like a campground and more like a controlled zone. Tents were being inspected, cars were checked, visitors were interviewed. But Hazel Carter, 2 years old, had vanished into thin air without a sound, a witness or a trace. The last place anyone saw her alive was on a blanket just 10 feet from her mother, and the only thing she left behind was a shoe. By late morning, the trailhead at Station 9 was no longer just a quiet access point. It had become the heart of a growing emergency response. Park protocol kicked in almost instantly. Rangers who'd spent years patrolling Pine Glade's 200,000 acres knew the first 24 hours were everything. The call-out was fast, coordinated, and by the book. Within 4 hours of Hazel Carter's disappearance, a multi-agency search and rescue operation was underway. At 1:10 p.m., the first K-9 unit arrived from Clearwater County, followed minutes later by a volunteer unit from Coeur d'Alene. Helicopters were deployed by mid-afternoon, flying grid patterns above the river corridor and surrounding ravines. They used FLIR, forward-looking infrared, to scan for heat signatures in the dense underbrush. But nothing appeared beyond the warm blur of the search teams themselves. Conditions were ideal: 70 degrees, clear skies, and minimal wind. There should have been something. Searchers fanned out in organized waves, marking GPS coordinates as they went. They called Hazel's name, gently, then louder. A ranger with 18 years in the field later said it was one of the eeriest deployments he'd worked, not because of what they found, but because they found so little. No prints, no fabric, no broken vegetation that could confidently be tied to a toddler's passage. The woods seemed untouched. For a child so small, moving alone would have left a trail. But the ground gave up no answers. Megan and Jacob were moved to an administrative cabin near Station 9, where deputies kept them warm and monitored. Megan refused to sleep. She kept stepping out every few minutes, scanning the tree line, arms crossed over her chest like she was trying to hold herself still. Jacob paced. When asked to recount the morning again, he grew short, voice flat, then apologetic. He said he'd gone up the trail for firewood, said he remembered the exact spot where he turned back. He remembered hearing birds. Then her name, shouted in a way he'd never heard before. By nightfall, dozens of searchers were on the ground. Fire crews, volunteers, even off-duty rangers showed up to help. Teams lit up the forest with portable flood lamps, combed riverbanks with rope lines, and tested current speeds with biodegradable dye. At the request of Park Command, the dam 11 miles downstream was temporarily closed, reducing river flow to a slow, muddy crawl in hopes that anything caught along the banks would become visible. Even so, they found nothing. No splash was ever heard, no slide marks at the shore. If she had fallen in, the river didn't seem to know it. On day 2, the scent dogs returned. This time, they were led further out from the original trail. One of them, an older bloodhound named Rosie, caught something faint near a moss-covered boulder overlooking the river. The boulder was roughly 40 yards from the tent, just off a deer path. She alerted once, then circled. Then, nothing. The scent stopped there, inexplicably. Rangers recorded the spot, flagged it, and checked the slope below. It was steep but walkable. There were no drag marks, no snapped limbs, no torn cloth. Nothing that suggested a child had stumbled, rolled, or been carried. And yet the dog had reacted, like Hazel had been there, then disappeared. Theories began forming almost as quickly as the search effort had. At first, the working theory was environmental, animal predation, most likely. Pine Glade was home to black bears, cougars, and coyotes. But those attacks, though rare, left evidence. There would have been sound, signs of struggle, blood. Wildlife biologists consulted by the park pointed out that Hazel's missing shoe, found clean, undamaged, and dry, didn't align with a predator event. She'd been wearing both when she vanished. If something had grabbed her, the shoe should have shown damage or been torn free in a panic. But it hadn't. It looked like it had been removed or placed. The second theory, she had wandered off and drowned. It was plausible. The river wasn't deep at that bend, but the undercurrent near the outer bank was strong. Still, there was no indication of disturbed soil near the water's edge. Hazel would have had to walk quietly, directly, and with impossible purpose to end up in the river without leaving a trail. Divers searched anyway, probing the cold water with poles and sonar. They found nothing. By day 3, The tone shifted. The lead investigator, Detective Lorne Peters, ordered a background check on all registered park visitors. Vehicles were cross-referenced. A few campers reported seeing someone moving fast on the upper trail the morning Hazel disappeared, but no one could describe a face. Megan and Jacob were questioned again, this time separately. Both remained cooperative. Polygraphs were quietly scheduled. Rangers widened the search grid to 10 miles. Fresh volunteers arrived, but still, not one piece of Hazel's clothing, not a hair, not a toy, not a sound. Only the single shoe and a faint dog alert on a boulder now circled in yellow tape. The forest had closed around them, silent and indifferent, and the longer it stayed that way, the more people began to wonder if this wasn't an accident. If someone, or something, had taken Hazel, not nature. By day 4, the mood around Pine Glade had shifted from urgency to scrutiny. The search teams were still out there, boots moving through brush, hands dragging branches aside, but behind the scenes, priorities were evolving. No new evidence had surfaced, no sightings, no calls, no notes. Hazel hadn't wandered out and simply gotten lost. That narrative was wearing thin. As the hours ticked forward and the trail stayed cold, pressure mounted from a new direction: the public. Media vans began arriving outside the ranger station, lining up alongside the makeshift command center with satellite dishes and long-lens cameras. Reporters asked the same question again and again. How does a 2-year-old vanish from a campsite with no trace, no witnesses, and no sound? By the end of that week, Hazel Carter's face was on every regional broadcast and front page in the Pacific Northwest. The photo used most often showed her in a sunflower dress, smiling at something just off frame, her front teeth slightly spaced apart. That smile became the symbol of the case. But behind it, public interest grew less about Hazel and more about her parents. Social media groups formed overnight, combing through every available detail. Megan's tearful press appearance was clipped, analyzed, and slowed down frame by frame. Her pauses were debated, her phrasing dissected. In one viral post, someone pointed out that she referred to Hazel in the past tense, once. Others noticed that Jacob rarely looked directly at the cameras. Within days, hashtags began trending. Speculation bloomed in every corner of the internet, and the Carters, still shattered, still waiting, were now under a different kind of spotlight. Law enforcement had anticipated it. In every child disappearance, its standard protocol: start at the center. On June 19th, both Jacob and Megan were quietly asked to take polygraphs at the sheriff's substation in Clearwater. Jacob's results came back clean. Megan's didn't. According to internal notes later leaked, her answers triggered stress indicators on several key questions. The result wasn't a confession. It wasn't even technically a failure. The official term was inconclusive. But in the eyes of investigators already grasping for leads, it was enough to take a closer look. A team was assigned to dig into the Carters' background, starting with family services. There were no red flags, no past reports, no calls to CPS. But one detail caught their attention. The couple had briefly separated 2 years earlier, during Megan's pregnancy. They had reconciled, but there were mentions of unresolved trust issues. Detectives wondered quietly if there had been tension on the trip, an argument, a moment of frustration, something that escalated. Then came the phone records. Routine data collection showed a curious timestamp. At 2:03 a.m., the night before Hazel vanished, Megan had placed a call to her sister in Spokane. The call rang twice, then went unanswered. Megan never mentioned it during her initial interviews. When questioned about it 2 days later, she hesitated, then explained she'd heard something outside the tent and panicked. She described it as a crunching sound, like feet in dry leaves. She said she didn't wake Jacob because she thought she was imagining things, that it might have been an animal. She reached for her phone out of instinct, called her sister, then hung up. Her explanation wasn't outrageous, but the omission bothered investigators. And now, with no other suspects, it became a crack, small but widening. The press conference on June 21st was meant to redirect attention back to the case. Instead, it made things worse. Megan stood beside Jacob and a sheriff's department spokesperson, reading a short, handwritten plea. Halfway through, she broke down, voice trembling, body shaking. Jacob reached for her hand, but she didn't seem to feel it. Her voice cracked on Hazel's name. She begged anyone who had her to just bring her back and said they'd forgive anything if she was returned safely. To some, it was raw, human, unmistakably maternal. To others, it was too composed or too performative. The internet's judgment was swift and unrelenting. Comment threads flooded with armchair analysis. Every blink, every pause was fuel for suspicion. The couple who had once been seen as grieving victims were now targets of endless speculative doubt. Detectives kept their theories close to the vest, but internally they began looking harder at inconsistencies. How long had Jacob really been gone collecting firewood? Why had neither of them heard anything? Why hadn't Megan mentioned the strange sound before? And if someone had taken Hazel, why hadn't there been a struggle or noise or signs of forced entry into the tent? None of it fit cleanly. It was a puzzle missing its edge pieces. But even as suspicion thickened, no direct evidence pointed to foul play. No blood, no injuries, no trace of Hazel in the vehicle or on the parents' clothes, no motive, no confession, no body. The search had gone cold, and now the investigation was clouded. The public wanted answers. The police wanted clarity. And Megan, already broken under the weight of loss, was now being quietly watched for something else, a mistake, a slip, any sign of a deeper truth. Exactly 1 week after Hazel Carter disappeared, a park ranger named Tom Delaney made a quiet report to his supervisor. During a secondary sweep of a fire access trail behind a restricted maintenance area, roughly 1.2 miles from the Carters' campsite, he'd come across a set of tire tracks pressed into soft, shaded soil, a track few visitors even knew existed, let alone were allowed to use. The ruts were deep, curved slightly along the edge of the incline, and measured for a wide wheelbase consistent with an off-road vehicle. Delaney knew every ranger and registered responder by vehicle type, and none matched what he was seeing. These weren't from a government truck, a search ATV, or a volunteer's SUV. These were fresh. The mud hadn't even begun to dry at the edges, and that stretch of trail had been closed off to the public since spring due to erosion. According to protocol, it shouldn't have seen any civilian activity at all. Photos were taken. The tire impressions were cast. Still, without cameras in that sector and no witnesses to its use, the discovery fell into the frustrating category of potentially important but unprovable. Rangers tightened checkpoints, interviewed nearby campers again, and started a sweep of every registered 4x4 entering the park over the previous 10 days. Nothing matched exactly, but the timing of the tracks and their direction away from the search zone stirred something in the lead investigator. It suggested one thing: movement after the fact. Someone had been in the area who shouldn't have, and they may have exited through the back. The very next day, another lead surfaced. An elderly man named Carl Emerson, 73, arrived at Station 9 unannounced with a hand-drawn map and a folder of hiking permits. He'd been in the western sector of Pine Glade the morning Hazel vanished, camping solo near a ridge 3 miles west of the main river bend. His camp hadn't been on the immediate radar during the initial search due to its remoteness, and no one had connected him to the case. But after hearing about the missing girl on the news, he'd come forward. He said that around sunrise, maybe 5:15, maybe a little later, he'd been boiling water for tea when he noticed someone walking the lower trail that curved around the edge of the trees. The figure was male, average build, in a gray hoodie with the hood pulled tight. But what caught Carl's attention was that the man was carrying something bundled, something blue, like a large towel or blanket. He said the man never looked up, never paused, just moved quickly and awkwardly, like he was trying to stay out of view. Investigators listened carefully. Carl's tone was calm, but he was unsure about the details. He couldn't remember the man's face. He couldn't say which direction he came from, or if he heard a car. But he remembered the towel, and he remembered the man holding it like it was heavy, or fragile. When asked why he waited a full week to come forward, Carl looked down at the table. "I didn't want to get involved," he said. "But then I thought, If that was my grandkid, I'd want someone to say something. For the first time since day 2, the case had a direction. A sketch artist was brought in. Carl described the figure as best he could, focusing on posture, build, and approximate age. The result was vague. A generic male in his 30s or 40s, medium height, light stubble. There was no distinctive feature, no tattoo, no limp. The hoodie color, gray, was the only confirmed detail. Still, the sketch was circulated through law enforcement databases and the media. Calls came in, dozens, some promising, most not. None of them matched. No one stepped forward claiming to have seen the man again. No campers in adjacent sites recalled anything unusual. Park security footage was reviewed again, but the trail Carl described wasn't under surveillance. The theory shifted. If the tire tracks and the man in the hoodie were connected, then Hazel's disappearance might not have been spontaneous. It could have been planned. This changed everything. Megan and Jacob were quietly notified. Their names were pulled back from the internal list of person of interest reviews, though suspicion never truly vanished in the court of public opinion. But to the investigators now leaning toward a stranger abduction theory, the puzzle had grown darker and wider. Whoever this man was, he had left no digital trail, no ransom note, no communication, no DNA. It was like he passed through the trees, took a child, and disappeared back into the wild. Detectives widened their scope beyond Pine Glade. They looked at registered offenders, drifters, and known trespassers in neighboring counties. Old ranger logs were pulled, including unlicensed camper reports going back 3 seasons. Forensic psychologists were consulted to draft a profile, but without a name, a plate, a witness who could identify a face, the case slipped again into that terrible in-between space. Too much to ignore, not enough to act on. The search effort officially transitioned from rescue to recovery by day 10. Teams scaled back. Helicopter hours were reduced, volunteers were released, but the discovery of those tire tracks and that silent figure carrying something wrapped in blue at dawn left a permanent scar on the investigation. It proved someone else had been out there, someone unaccounted for, someone who hadn't come forward. And while it offered a sliver of possibility that Hazel was taken, not lost, it also deepened the fear. Because if she had been taken, then whoever did it had gotten away clean. It had been 42 days since Hazel Carter vanished from Pine Glade, and the forest had grown quiet again. The search efforts, once relentless and expansive, had scaled down to a skeletal crew. What had once been a command center buzzing with radio chatter was now reduced to a corkboard of dead-end leads and a binder marked "Open, Inactive." The Carters had returned home, or what was left of it. Megan stopped responding to reporters. Jacob filed paperwork to take an unpaid leave from his job. No memorials were planned. There was still no body, no confirmation, and for some, that meant there was still a sliver of hope. But most who'd worked the case had already felt the momentum drain away until August 3rd, when the river offered up its first whisper of something. 17 miles downstream from Station 9, near a bend known to locals as Widow's Hollow, a seasonal ranger named Dana Kravitz was checking erosion patterns after a series of late summer storms. It was part of her routine patrol, noting washed-out roots, shifting stones, trail hazards. As she moved along the overgrown riverbank, she spotted something unnatural snagged on a dry thistle bush just above the high water mark. At first glance, it looked like trash, a strip of fabric, faded pink. But as she approached, she noticed the stitching, the shape. It wasn't garbage. It was a child's sleeve. The cloth fragment was no bigger than a wallet, but it was intact. No tears, no signs of shredding or bite marks. The color was dulled by water, but clearly once vibrant. Pink cotton with white stitching along the seam. Dana placed it into an evidence bag, called her supervisor, and by that evening it was on its way to the lab. The turnaround was fast. Within 3 days, forensic results came back. The sleeve bore traces of Hazel Carter's DNA, along with high concentrations of river silt and algae consistent with long-term submersion, but no predator saliva, no blood, no violence. The fabric hadn't been ripped or torn free. It had come off, gently. The find changed everything. Investigators reassembled, this time focusing downstream. Widow's Hollow became ground zero. It wasn't an ordinary stretch of river. Locals had long whispered about its strange currents, how things sank there and didn't float back up. 3 drownings had occurred in that pocket over the last 20 years, all within 50 yards of the same tree-studded bend. The river, calm on the surface, masked a slow-turning whirl beneath. It was, according to divers, a holding pool, a place where debris settled and sometimes stayed hidden for months. Divers were sent in within 48 hours of the cloth's discovery. They entered in teams, tethered and guided by sonar from the surface. Visibility was poor, the silt thick and quick to rise with each motion. But 10 feet below, near the curve of the bend, one of them found something that didn't belong. A patch of riverbed stones had been rearranged, oddly smooth in a rectangular formation. It wasn't natural. Something or someone had disturbed the bed. Sonar confirmed a hard surface just beneath it. As the divers cleared away the rocks, a shape emerged, metal, corroded, flat-bottomed. It was an old utility sled, the kind rangers once used decades ago to haul equipment through shallow water and mud. Most had been decommissioned by the 1980s. It was half buried, camouflaged by algae and thyme. Inside were only a few things: rounded river stones, bits of broken branches, and what initially appeared to be animal remains. Small bones, scattered, a raccoon possibly, or an otter, nothing that could be tied to Hazel. Still, the discovery rattled the team. Why had the sled been there? Who had moved those rocks to cover it, and how had the cloth fragment ended up snagged 17 miles downstream, near this specific bend, at this specific time, after weeks of silence? The timing raised eyebrows. River currents were unpredictable, but they weren't random. And if the cloth had traveled that far, why hadn't anything else come with it? No shoe, no toy, no other clothing. Just one intact piece of fabric, as if it had been released intentionally. The sled was hauled out and stored. Forensics examined the interior, but age and corrosion made results inconclusive. No fingerprints, no trace DNA, just rust and time. The bones, too, offered no breakthroughs. Non-human, degraded, irrelevant to the case, officially. But to those who had spent weeks walking circles through the woods, it felt like the river was teasing them, giving just enough to reawaken the fear, just enough to reopen the wound. Theories began circulating again. Had someone used the river to stage a disappearance? Could Hazel have been held somewhere, then dumped? Was it possible she'd been alive for days, even weeks, before the water took her? Or was this fragment of cloth simply a piece of something that had long since vanished, drifting silently until caught by chance? There were no answers, only questions. But the tone had changed. Hazel Carter was no longer just missing in the woods. She was now missing in the river. And the river, it seemed, was starting to speak. By the time September faded into October, the air in Pine Glade carried more than the weight of early frost. The search crews were gone, the media vans had long since pulled away, and the yellow tape that once ringed Station 9 had been removed and folded into case files. Officially, the case remained open, an active investigation. But in practice, the silence had set in. No further evidence had been found, no suspects had emerged, no sightings, no confessions, no recovery. The river, once promising, had yielded nothing new. And yet, as the state's investigative presence thinned, something else began to take root in the vacuum left behind, something colder, meaner, and far more unpredictable. Rumors. At first, it started with whispered blame. A few old-timers pointed fingers at the seasonal workers, those who came and went from ranger housing without much notice. Others cast suspicion on hikers passing through from out of state, especially the kind who didn't sign the permit logs. But soon, the theories hardened. A handful of townsfolk began spreading the idea that Hazel's disappearance hadn't been random or opportunistic. They believed it was ritual, deliberate, a pattern no one had dared to recognize until now. Social media groups began compiling names, children who had gone missing in surrounding counties in the last 40 years. Most had explanations: custody disputes, drownings, verified accidents. But a few didn't. Posts circulated showing grainy scans of ranger incident logs from the 1980s and 90s, documents never meant for the public. They told of unlicensed camps discovered deep in the northern sector, far from any trail. One log described a ring of stones with scorch marks and small animal carcasses laid in a deliberate circle. Another referenced a shrine of bones and dolls near Bledsoe's Crag, logged in 1989, never investigated further. That was enough. Theories exploded overnight. Pine Glade wasn't just home to hikers and black bears. It was now to some a place of secrets, of hidden beliefs and old rites. Forums lit up with screenshots and map overlays. Anonymous users claimed knowledge of buried evidence. One account posted GPS coordinates allegedly linked to a trapper's cabin that had burned down in 1997 under suspicious circumstances. The public record showed a lightning strike. Conspiracy threads said otherwise. And through it all, Megan and Jacob Carter remained frozen in the crosshairs. Megan withdrew almost entirely from public view. She declined all interviews, stopped attending search update briefings, and refused to answer the door to reporters. Those who saw her around town said she looked gaunt, hair tied back, face pale and distant. A clerk at the local gas station said she came in only once a week now, always early in the morning, always alone. Jacob, by contrast, left completely. He moved out of the state just before Thanksgiving, citing mental health reasons. Rumor had it he couldn't take the eyes anymore, the ones that followed him at the grocery store or sat 2 tables away in silence at the diner. Whatever sympathy had existed early on had long since curdled. Even the place itself began to feel different. The forest had always carried a kind of reverence, wide, quiet, indifferent, but now there was tension. Locals said it felt like it was holding its breath. One family that had camped at Station 9 every summer for over a decade skipped it for the first time in memory. Another couple who'd hiked the Upper Basin trails each fall moved their route 40 miles west. And near the site where Hazel had last been seen, a small wooden cross had been placed by volunteers, a simple memorial etched with her initials and the words, "Still looking." Within a week, it was defaced. Someone had carved the word liar across the front with a pocket knife, deep enough to split the grain. The cross was replaced a few days later. That one was broken in half. Police never identified who was responsible. When asked, the sheriff shrugged and said emotions were running high. But it was more than that. Hazel's disappearance had done something irreversible to the town. It had stripped away the illusion that Pine Glade was safe, that tragedy only happened elsewhere. The wilderness that once offered quiet now buzzed with suspicion. People watched each other too closely, said too little, believed too much. And beneath it all, the knowledge that the trail had gone cold, that a child could disappear so completely in daylight, sat like rot in the middle of it all. There was still no proof of foul play, no body, no witness willing to say they'd seen what had happened. But that only made it worse. In the absence of answers, people built their own truths. Some said Hazel had never been real, that the Carters made it all up. Others swore it had to be a drifter, a man in a hoodie no one ever saw again. And a few, quiet but persistent, still believed in something older, darker, and buried just beneath the surface of the trees. Something that had always been there, waiting. In the spring of 2015, heavy storms swept across northern Idaho, turning the Clearwater River into a volatile channel of fast-moving water and submerged debris. Locals were used to the cycle, late melt, high current, and a sharp uptick in rescue calls. But that May, the flood season brought more than broken limbs and stranded hikers. It brought a body. And then, something else. On May 18th, 2 college students from Boise State were canoeing along a narrow curve of the Clearwater known as Widow's Hollow. It had rained hard the night before, and the river was swollen, pushing against its usual banks. Locals knew better than to take small crafts into that stretch, especially after a storm. But the students, young, overconfident, unaware, launched anyway. About 30 minutes in, the canoe struck a submerged log, tilted sharply, and capsized. One of them, David Lynn, made it to shore with a fractured wrist and mild hypothermia. The other, Julian Merritt, didn't resurface. A multi-day recovery operation was launched. Divers returned to Widow's Hollow, focusing on the same bend that had swallowed him. It was dangerous territory, a place already infamous for strange currents and deep shelves, including the same one that had once been searched in connection with Hazel Carter. Julian's body was found 2 days later, lodged between two boulders and pinned by current. It was a tragic but not unusual outcome. What was unusual came shortly after. While sweeping an area roughly 50 yards east of the 2012 grid, a diver spotted something odd wedged beneath a ledge of stone, not organic, not natural. It was wedged tightly between the rock wall and a heavy root system. Initially, it looked like trash, dull pink, partially wrapped in tangled line, the kind of debris that usually gets bagged and discarded. But when the diver tugged it free, it came apart just enough to reveal molded plastic, matted synthetic hair, and a faded printed dress. It was a doll, waterlogged, decayed, and bound by what appeared to be aged fishing line. The face had eroded from river exposure. The eyes were stuck open. Back at the forensics lab, technicians examined it more carefully. At first glance, it looked like an old toy, maybe decades old. But microplastic analysis revealed something unexpected. The material was traced to a 2010 production batch from a now-defunct toy manufacturer. Even more telling were the fingerprint smudges preserved under a layer of sediment along the back of the doll's head. They were partial, but one of them, small, shallow, and surprisingly intact, matched a print on file from Hazel Carter's medical records. The doll was hers. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, Hazel's name was back in headlines across Idaho. News crews revisited old footage. Forums that had gone quiet reignited. Some treated it like a miracle, a sign, proof that Hazel had been near the water all along. Others took a darker view. The doll hadn't been floating loose. It had been trapped, coiled in fishing line, wedged deliberately. Some believed it had been placed, staged, and if it had, then someone had been down there after the disappearance, touching what she once held, hiding it. Forensics couldn't confirm when the doll entered the water. It could have been during the original search period, or much later. The fishing line was too degraded to determine age. No fingerprints other than Hazel's were recoverable. The only thing certain was that it had not been at that location during the original 2012 dive sweeps. That section hadn't been searched back then. The grid had stopped short. Speculation took over. One theory held that the doll had floated down from the campsite, but the path it would have taken made that unlikely, especially with the way it was found wedged beneath rock. Another argued it had been placed there later, perhaps by someone trying to create a breadcrumb trail or send a message. Others believed it was genuine, just something missed during the first go-around. But if it had been missed, why had it taken 3 years and another tragedy for it to be found? Investigators reopened internal files. They reviewed sonar logs, cross-checked river flow data, re-interviewed surviving rangers. But no new leads emerged. The doll was returned to evidence, sealed and cataloged. It was the only object tied directly to Hazel found since the pink cloth in 2012. No other personal items, no shoes, no clothing, no remains had ever surfaced. The doll stood alone. A single object, touched by her, hidden by something, and found only because someone else had drowned nearby. In the months that followed, interest in the case spiked, then faded again. There was no momentum to hold on to, no further evidence, no new suspects. Just that doll, water-worn, silent, and unnervingly intact. The river had given something up again, not a body, not a clue that closed the case, but just enough to make everyone remember, and just enough to remind them that whatever had happened in those woods still wasn't finished. In July of 2017, Pine Glade was in the grip of a relentless drought. For the first time in over a decade, the Clearwater River dropped more than 3 feet below its seasonal average. Tributaries that usually ran with steady current dried into cracked stone gullies, and smaller offshoots turned stagnant, exposing beds no one had seen in years. Rangers were instructed to patrol the river's edge more frequently, checking for fire hazards, stranded wildlife, and signs of illegal dumping. It was during one of these routine patrols that Ranger Andrea Sloan stumbled across something she didn't immediately understand. She had been walking a narrow cutoff about 8 miles downstream from Widow's Hollow, a tributary long since dried to a trickle, when she noticed a small pile of bone fragments clustered in the crook of a low-hanging branch. At first, she assumed it was animal remains, deer or coyote maybe. But as she approached, the structure of one bone became clear, a small femur, smooth and rounded at the ends, no longer than her forearm. Nearby, half buried in the silt, was a rubber shoe sole, cracked and brittle, still faintly pink. The size was unmistakable. She radioed it in. Within hours, the area was cordoned off and forensic teams were flown in from Boise. The bones were scattered, clearly disturbed by scavengers over time, but enough remained for a tentative identification. A partial skull fragment showed juvenile dental development consistent with a toddler. The femur and vertebrae had been weathered and sun-bleached, some chewed, some crushed, but not burned. The shoe sole was consistent with the ones Hazel Carter had last been seen wearing. But the confirmation didn't come until 5 days later, when lab technicians matched the dental pattern from the skull to Hazel's pediatric records. The case was no longer a mystery, at least not in the legal sense. Hazel Carter was dead. But the most unsettling detail wasn't the bones, it wasn't the shoe. It was what they found, tucked beneath a nearby rock ledge, deliberately wedged into a dry crevice no larger than a milk crate. It was a military-style lockbox, rusted nearly shut, the latch swollen with time. It took nearly 20 minutes and a pry bar to get it open. Inside were pages, dozens of them, folded, waterlogged, ink-blurred, but unmistakably hand-drawn, children's drawings, crude stick figures holding hands, suns and trees, stars with wide loops. But what froze the team was the final image, stuck to the inner wall of the box, a winding blue line representing a river, and thick red scribbles in the center, radiating outward like something bleeding through. The box had no fingerprints, no name, no origin. The drawings weren't signed, no notebook cover, no date, just loose, warped sheets sealed in with mold and rot. Investigators photographed every page, then collected the box as evidence. It was sent off for material analysis, which dated the paper and ink roughly within the last 10 years, well within the window of Hazel's disappearance. Experts couldn't say whether Hazel had drawn them herself. There were similarities to other known samples, loops, figure shapes, line confidence, but nothing conclusive. What disturbed the agents more was the implication. Someone had gathered these pages, stored them, and placed the box under that ledge deliberately. And it had sat there undisturbed for years. The public was never told. The discovery of Hazel's remains was quietly entered into the record, filed as a recovery, not a homicide. No press release was issued, no new alerts. Megan and Jacob were notified separately, in private, and advised not to speak to media. What had once been a case filled with public emotion was now handled behind closed doors. The lockbox was sealed in evidence. The drawings were classified. Only a handful of Rangers knew what had been found that day, and fewer still were willing to talk about it. One of them, years later and long retired, gave an anonymous statement to a freelance journalist. He said he didn't understand why the box had been buried in the report. It wasn't just trash in a river, he said. It was something someone put there, something they wanted us to find, or not find. And if the public had known about that box, it would have changed how people saw the whole story. But that story, at least officially, was now closed. Hazel Carter had died. Her remains were found in a place no one had looked before, in a stretch of river that only dried out once every few decades. The timing had been perfect, or cruel. And the questions that remained, about who placed the drawings, why they were hidden, and what the red marks in the river meant, would never be answered. Because no one was looking anymore. Not really. The case file had moved from the active shelf to the archive drawer, but the forest hadn't forgotten, and neither had the river. The formal notice came by certified mail embodied on February of 2018. It arrived at Megan Carter's new address in Oregon, addressed to her legal name but with no return contact. The letter confirmed that remains recovered from the Clearwater tributary the previous summer had been conclusively identified as Hazel Carter. The enclosed documentation included a final autopsy summary, limited due to decomposition, and an official Idaho-issued death certificate listing cause of death as accidental drowning, secondary to unknown circumstances. No injuries, no indication of assault, no evidence of foul play, just a date, a location, and a quiet administrative close to a 6-year investigation that had long since unraveled in the public eye. No press conference was held. The sheriff's office submitted a short public filing citing a difficult but conclusive resolution. The case, once the subject of national media attention, now slipped out of the headlines with barely a ripple. A small memorial plaque was added to the wall of Ranger Station 9, just beneath a mounted aerial photograph of the Clearwater River. It read, "In memory of Hazel Carter, 2010 to 2012. Always remembered." A few rangers stood in silence that afternoon. No one spoke. Privately, though, questions lingered. Those who had worked the case closely, divers, forensic technicians, wilderness search experts, were uneasy with the way it ended. The location of Hazel's remains didn't align with historical current flow data. Her bones had been found upstream of the main whirlpool path, tucked into a dry tributary bed that had no consistent outflow during flood seasons. The odds of her body drifting naturally to that point, then settling undisturbed for 6 years, were considered extremely low. And then there was the condition of the remains themselves. The fragmentary skeleton showed minimal animal damage, despite being exposed for what should have been multiple cycles of drought, flood, and scavenger activity. No birds, no rodents, no known movement. It was as if something, or someone, had placed her there with care. And then, of course, there was the box, the lockbox, found wedged beneath a rock ledge within 30 feet of the skeletal remains, was quietly sealed into evidence and filed under non-probative discovery. Officially, it held no forensic value. No fingerprints had been recovered, no human trace DNA, no inscriptions, no link to a known subject. Unofficially, it disturbed nearly everyone who saw it. The drawings, childlike, water-warped, but strangely coherent, didn't match any known forensic profiles for hoaxes. Experts couldn't explain the red markings in the river image, nor the presence of deliberate folds on each page. Some speculated they were left as messages, others that they were left as taunts. The theory that Hazel had drawn them herself couldn't be confirmed, but it also couldn't be ruled out. Which raised another question. If Hazel had died shortly after vanishing, who drew those pictures? And when? Megan Carter refused all interview requests. She had filed for divorce in 2016, moved out of state quietly, and was now living under a new name. Former neighbors said she rarely spoke of Hazel. Her social media accounts were scrubbed. A few tabloids tried to follow her, publishing grainy photos of her entering a market or walking in a park. None got close. One journalist, who'd mailed her a letter directly asking if she believed Hazel had died alone, received no reply. The envelope was returned, unopened. Locals, meanwhile, had not forgotten. Rumors picked up where the official story left off. Some believed Hazel had survived for days or weeks after the disappearance, hidden, held captive, perhaps by a recluse in the northern forest. Stories of off-grid dwellers had circulated in the region for decades, old hermits, war veterans, mentally unstable survivalists who built traps and lived in hollowed-out cabins. One theory claimed Hazel had been taken, kept alive, and then died of exposure or illness, her body hidden until someone decided it was time to let her go. That theory gained traction after word of the lockbox leaked, though no one would go on record confirming its existence. Others dismissed it all as manufactured. They believed the drawings were fake, planted by someone seeking attention or crafting a local legend. They argued that no one had seen anything suspicious in 6 years, that Hazel's disappearance was tragic, but explainable, that she had simply wandered too far, slipped into the river, and was carried down in silence. The doll, the cloth, the bones, all scattered naturally over time. No foul play, no deeper meaning. Just a child and a mistake in the wild. But even those who clung to that version couldn't explain one thing: why no trace of Hazel had surfaced until after the river receded to record lows. Why her body had been found in a spot that made no environmental sense. Why the drawings existed at all. Or why, after 6 years, the story had ended not with justice or discovery or peace, but with a box in an evidence locker, a death certificate mailed in silence, and a toddler's smile etched into memory without closure. Hazel Carter had been found, but what had happened to her remained unresolved. In the early spring of 2023, more than a decade after Hazel Carter vanished, a padded envelope arrived at the office of a small independent news outlet in Boise. There was no return address, no note, just a flash drive, a collection of printed photographs, and a yellowed memo marked "Internal Only, Not for External Release." The reporter who received it, Nora Willens, had never covered the case directly, but like most in Idaho media, she knew the name. Everyone did. Hazel Carter wasn't just a lost child. She had become folklore, a ghost tied to the forest. And yet the contents of that envelope proved that even the most tragic stories can still hold darker corners. Corners someone wanted hidden. The leak came from within Pine Glades Ranger System. Later, quietly, it was confirmed that the source had only joined the service in 2021. Young, idealistic, and unaware of the case's full weight, he'd stumbled across archived materials during a routine audit of evidence logs. What he found disturbed him deeply. But what disturbed him more was the pattern of omission. The box, the one found near Hazel's remains, had never been officially logged in the final case report. It appeared in draft forms, in photo inventories, and in private ranger logs. But in the public record, it didn't exist. The drawings it contained were real, multiple images, stick figures and animals, rivers and trees. One showed a figure standing alone beside a dark shape that resembled a tent. Another depicted a river twisting through trees with heavy red scribbles where the current bent. The red lines had been examined by state psychologists. Their conclusion, detailed in the internal memo, the imagery, may suggest symbolic trauma representation and should not be disseminated to the public due to possible psychological repercussions for the victim's family and the community at large. One page included what appeared to be words, scrawled, uneven, difficult to interpret. Forensic linguists were brought in but offered no consensus. Some believed the letters spelled keep or help. Others thought it was just chaotic marks, the result of a child's unsteady hand. Either way, they were found in a sealed box wrapped in plastic, stashed beneath a rock ledge in a dry riverbed, 10 feet from where Hazel's bones had been. The photos, too, were damning. One in particular had never been seen outside the original Ranger investigation. It was taken 3 days before Hazel's disappearance, during a routine river survey conducted to measure erosion risk. The image, snapped from the north bank facing south, captured a broad view of the Clearwater's main bend. In the background, barely visible behind the branches, a man stood on the far bank, blurred, out of focus, but undeniably present. He wore a hooded sweatshirt and appeared to be holding something under one arm. His face was obscured by distance and shadow. The official interpretation labeled him a probable fisherman. No follow-up was documented, no effort to enhance the photo, no distribution to the press. But the timing, just 72 hours before Hazel vanished, and the proximity to where her scent trail ended, made that explanation feel thin. Especially now. Especially knowing that this man was never identified, that he was never questioned, that in all the years of renewed interest, cold case dives, and viral speculation, his image had been sitting in a folder marked "Do Not Release." The leak caused a quiet stir in official circles. No formal investigation was launched, no public statement was made. But behind closed doors, several former Rangers and local deputies confirmed to Willens that there had been concerns early on, that the lockbox had felt off, that the drawings were too coherent, too composed for a child missing and alone in the wild. One said it looked like something kept, not something dropped. Another admitted he'd long suspected Hazel hadn't died in the river, but had been placed there after. That someone had waited, maybe for days, maybe longer, then returned to the water under the cover of night. There had been no cameras, no witnesses, and the clear water, swollen with rain and glacier melt, erased everything with ease. Megan Carter was approached for comment. She declined. Her attorney later issued a statement asking for privacy and expressing hope that those still clinging to conspiracy would allow her daughter's memory to rest in peace. Jacob Carter could not be reached, but peace was never the shape this story took, not in Pine Glade, not in the woods. For those who lived through it, rangers who logged the early calls, volunteers who scanned the tree lines, divers who pulled the doll from under the rock, it never truly ended. It became something else, a scar beneath the surface, a silence that grew louder the longer it was ignored. Hazel's body had been found. Her disappearance was labeled an accident. Her case was closed. But to anyone who looked closely, at the sketches, at the sealed box, at the man in the photograph, the story didn't feel complete. There were too many fractures, too many gaps, and too much deliberate quiet. Today, the Clearwater River flows calmly through Pine Glade, clear in the shallow bends, cold and slow in the hollows. Families still hike the trails. Campers still pitch tents near Station 9. But some stay close to the marked sites. Some leave before dark. And every so often, someone walks the bend alone, looks out across the water, and thinks of her. The little girl in the pink shoes who vanished, who may have drawn pictures in the dark, who may have never been truly alone out there. The forest doesn't speak. Neither does the river. But for those who remember Hazel Carter, the silence feels like something alive, something watching, something still waiting to be understood.